afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs program. I'm Charity Fain, Executive Director of City Club, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on March 18th for this week's Friday Forum. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in the radio and television audiences, I ask everyone in the room who has not already done so to please silence your cell phones. Today, our panel will discuss public employee unions and collective bargaining in Oregon. But first, some announcements. I'd like to start by recognizing a couple of new City Club members. Would Althea Gregory and Dave DeMarkey please stand and be recognized? City Club recently kicked off its From Crisis to Opportunity Premier Issues series. On March 29th, the club's New Leaders program is offering a workshop where participants will attempt to successfully balance the state budget. You can join that and try your luck at it as well. Other upcoming NLC events include a Portland Trivia Night at Tugboat Brewing Company and a volunteer session at the Children's Book Bank. Our Agora committee will be hosting a panel discussion about excellence in education. We very much appreciate our New Leaders Council sponsors, DHM Research and the Port of Portland, and our Agora sponsor, Tonkin Torp. To learn more about these and other events, please go to the City Club website, pdxcityclub.org. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone in the room who's a member to please stand up. I'd personally like to thank you all for just demonstrating by your membership that you value civic discourse and strive to become informed citizens and make informed decisions. It's people like you that truly make Portland a great place to live. So, thank you. For those of you who did not stand up, now is the time to join City Club. We are currently in the midst of our 2-month membership drive, and if you join during this period, we'll waive the $25 new member fee, plus you'll receive a coupon for a complimentary lunch at a Friday Forum in the future. You know who now at your table is a member, and they can answer any questions that you might have. So please, there are forms at your table and in the back of the room. Today really is the day you've been waiting for, so please join. I'd also like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and also like to offer our appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support make these time-honored City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to our current sponsors, communications firm Morrell Inc., utility company Northwest Natural, and the law firm of Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. We are very grateful for your support. If your company or firm would like to join this group, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the office. And now, on to our program. While some state governments, such as Wisconsin and Ohio, are questioning the very existence of collective bargaining rights, Oregon's Governor John Kitzhaber has stated very clearly that such rights will continue. Nevertheless, some question the political power of Oregon's public employee unions, asking whether they have a disproportionate influence on public policy and spending decisions. With the public employee retirement system facing unfunded liabilities and healthcare costs skyrocketing, one might ask, do current collective bargaining laws support or impede efficient and cost-effective government services? Our panel today will help us find the answer to this question. Here to introduce today's panelist is moderator Jack Kondrasuk. Jack teaches management courses at the University of Portland's Pamplin School of Business Administration, does research on topics such as human resource management and terrorism, and provides volunteer services to civic and professional organizations. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota. Jack.
Thank you, Charity. Hi.
When I was studying for a PhD at the University of Minnesota, going to the Industrial Relations Center there, we were told that the battle cry was "Was ist die Evidence?" or facts. When I started working at the University of Portland about 37 years ago, the dean or boss that I had, Kent Collings, was very much into labor relations. And he said that we have to be fair. We have to show both sides. He was so fair that he was chosen by both sides as an arbitrator, labor arbitrator. So today we want to look at the facts. We want to be fair. Where do these things called unions, where did they come from? Well, long before I was born, during the Roman Empire, there were shoemakers called cordwainers, and they tended to form some early unions. In the United States, about 1790s, we had the start of unions. And that was people like printers and shoemakers, people like that. 1869, Knights of Labor. Now they brought in politics to unionization. And that's different because in general, in the United States, unions deal with economics, wages, hours, working conditions. In Europe, where many of our unions are patterned after, they had politics that were very important to them, but we don't here. 1886, Samuel Gompers started the American Federation of Labor. And in 1955, that was merged with another group called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In between, we had a depression, and we had World War I, World War II. World War I, we had about 6 million union members after World War I. After the Depression, we had about 3 million. Now, this is an important aspect for today, too, that during tough economic times, union membership tends to go down. 1935, the Wagner Act brought labor relations to the forefront and really encouraged unions to be formed. And they reached their maximum after World War II, towards the end of World War II, of about 35% of the workers, of the employees in the United States were unionized. And in 1947, another law, Taft-Hartley, changed things, made things a little more pro-management. And union numbers went down as a percentage of labor force to about 12% now. And we've got about 7% in the private sector that are unionized for that 12%, and 37% in the public sector. Now, in 1962, President John F. Kennedy had an executive order. So what it applied to unions in the private sector really wasn't applying that much in the public sector. So in '62, he said it was okay, basically, to form unions in the public sector in the federal level. Now, we still did not really have, we had some starting in the states. They were operating independently. So the public sector operates a little differently than the private sector. The first union that was formed in a state was about 50 years ago in Wisconsin. And that's an irony, isn't it? At the present time, we've got about 26 states that have collective bargaining for all their employees, about 12 that have collective bargaining for some of their employees, and 12 that do not have collective bargaining. Oregon started having unions in 1973. What is hitting at the present time, getting a lot of our attention, is what's been happening in Wisconsin. And whether you like that or don't like it, for or against it, what Governor Walker has been doing, what 14 Democrats who went into Illinois to avoid voting were doing, I get to be very involved with that because that's my home state. That's where I came from. And I have a lot of relatives back there. Some go down and protest. I've been involved in all the protests on the Democratic union side, if that's one way of looking at it, because that's the way he looks at it. Another one is a staunch Republican legislator in the state of Illinois and is opposed to unions, but is more interested in the issues. Jim Sasha also worked with another fellow for a joint measure, although Jim was Republican. This other guy was, I think, Democrat Barack Obama. He was a legislator there. Maybe you've heard that name. And I hear about other relatives that talk about how what's happening back in Wisconsin is tearing families apart. So, I want to talk about some of these issues. I want to introduce first our panelists this morning to talk about that, or this afternoon. Leslie Frane, over here, is the National Public Division Director for the Service Employees International Union, SEIU. And she represents over 1 million public employees. That's a big job. And SEIU also has over 1 million private sector employees. She was also the executive director of SEIU Local 503 in Oregon, representing 45,000 public and private sector employees. And she spends a lot of her time in the air and doing all this work. She's traveling to Washington, D.C. and to various states to work with public sector employees. Farther to my right, Jack Roberts. Went to the University of Oregon, there of journalism, law school. He was a private sector attorney in private practice for about 9 to 10 years. He was first appointed, then twice elected to the Lane County Board of Commissioners. Later, in 1994, he was elected State Labor Commissioner in Oregon, and he was reelected in 1998. Jack Roberts is now the Executive Director for Lane Metro Partnership, where he's trying to expand the economy and produce more jobs in Lane County. So the first question we would have, first question for our panelists, is what is really happening now in the United States in public sector bargaining? We read about these things, very controversial aspects in the news. What is really happening? And first will be Leslie Frane.
Good morning. What I think is really happening in Wisconsin and other states is that working people, and not just union members, are facing an unprecedented assault by partisan politicians and by corporate donors who elected them. The Koch brothers are the best example of that, but let's be clear, they're not the only ones. This is a coordinated, logical next step that follows decades of policies that included deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, and a record-breaking concentration of wealth in the hands of the richest people in this country. These policies made it possible in 2009 for Wall Street to crash, for Wall Street bankers to crash the economy, to create a foreclosure crisis, an employment crisis, and basically the middle class has been left holding the bag. Now we're seeing the next phase underway in states like Wisconsin, and I think Wisconsin is a good example of where it's been crystallized. It's a national phenomenon, but in some ways I think Governor Walker is a good poster child for it. And I think that the best way to look at Wisconsin is to look at a package of policies, not just the collective bargaining issue. It started really before Governor Walker was elected, when he announced during the campaign that if elected, he would reject stimulus dollars that were slated to build a light rail in Milwaukee and would have created thousands of jobs. But Governor Walker turned that down because his ideological commitment to small government outweighed his desire to create much needed jobs in a city like Milwaukee where unemployment was very high. He proposed and then passed tax cuts in two categories. One is cutting the capital gains tax, and two is cutting corporate taxes, neither of which the preponderance of evidence would suggest creates jobs. He's proposed cutting all kinds of social programs. Some examples are early childhood education and also, unbelievably, anti-fraud enforcement funds. And finally, late in the night, he got the legislature to pass a bill practically speaking, eliminating collective bargaining for public employees. And I'm very pleased to announce that this morning, a judge in Wisconsin has issued a temporary restraining order, putting that law temporarily on hold, but the battle continues. I think it's important to look at these policies as a package, because this is not fundamentally about unions or about taxpayers. I think it's really about an extreme right-wing agenda to try to use an economic crisis that was caused by Wall Street to pass through some radical reforms that otherwise would never have been possible. It's kind of a 1-2-3 punch: slash taxes, slash services, and then silence what is perhaps the most effective advocate on behalf of the middle class, working families in our communities in this country. It's dangerous, it's spreading, and the one silver lining that I see in this is that across the country, we're seeing the middle class fighting back in numbers that we haven't seen in decades. And in the process, I think we are beginning to reframe the debate over who caused the budget crisis. Is the budget crisis caused by the banks, who caused our economy to melt down, who caused a foreclosure crisis and an unemployment crisis? Or is it caused by the social worker next door who earns $36,000 a year protecting abused kids? I think we're beginning to see that question answered in a way that I think provide the facts that Jack talked about earlier. And I want to close my introduction by telling a joke that I'm sure many of you saw, because it kind of went viral on the internet last week, and that's the story of the 12 cookies. It's the story of a CEO, a Tea Partier, and a union member sitting in a room together, and there's a plate on the table with 12 cookies. And the CEO takes 11 of the cookies for himself and then says to the Tea Partier, "You better be careful, because that union guy is going to take your cookie." I don't usually tell jokes because I'm bad at it. But I think it's really a good parallel for what's happening in this country. And I want to just end with a couple of statistics that I think tell the facts behind the joke. Between 1989 and 2000, both public sector and private sector total compensation increased by about 12%. Let me back up. That's pay. 1989 to 2010, public and private sector pay increased 12%. If you add in benefits, you will see that public sector compensation actually went up a little bit more. The total compensation numbers are 18% for the private sector and 21% for the public sector. So 3% more for the public sector than the private sector in terms of increases over the last 20 years. But during roughly the same time period, if you look at what happened to the total increased wealth in this country, you'll see that the top 1% of our population got 56% of the total increased wealth, while the bottom 90% shared 16% of that increase. Now, if you do that math, what it means is the folks at the top got 300 times as much as the bottom 90% on a per capita basis. So we have public versus private sector workers, a 3% difference. And then we have the top 1% and the bottom 90%, and we have a 300% difference. And I would argue that if we want to talk about fairness and we'd want to talk about equity in our country, that the 300% number is the one that we should be focusing on, not the 3%.
Okay, Jack?
When I agreed to come here, one of the things I wanted to make clear is that we're not here for a debate. This is not like one of the cable TV shows where we each carve out our position and argue that. I think, frankly, if you're looking at what's happening today, there is clearly a very large political component to that. And I'm not here to defend that or to explain what the reasoning is. I think it's pretty obvious what elections are about and what positioning yourself for the next election is about, and there's certainly a lot of that. By the same token, the issue about public employee collective bargaining would not be an effective political tool if there weren't some real concerns and, frankly, real resentments among the population as a whole. And I think it's important for us to talk about that and to think about that. And I understand the dynamic that we often hear, and as we just heard, about the money that's going to the upper income people and where that's happening. And we can have another debate sometime about how much of that is because of structural changes in the economy and how much of that is because of predatory practices, and I think there are elements of both involved in it. But what I do think is also important is to understand that this is not simply about the upper income folks versus the middle class or working class, and it's not even all about the solidarity of the workers together. Because if you go and see some of these demonstrations, a lot of those folks who are demonstrating against what's happening in Wisconsin, as well as those who are on the other side demonstrating against the unions, represent different components of the same working class. And part of what we have today is a perception, broadly held, that public employee unions have been able to carve out a position to protect their status that's not available in the private sector. And I think we're going to talk some more about that today. But there is a clear sense that public employees working for government agencies don't have to worry about competition, foreign or domestic, of people who can destroy the company they work for or undermine their competitive position, nor do they have the same kind of bargaining situation where the person across the table has an exclusive responsibility to the shareholders and the owners, but instead are going to be negotiating against people who are elected by everyone, including the taxpayers and voters who belong to the public employee unions. That creates a different dynamic. Whether it's because of that or because of other factors, there is a clear perception, and I would say in many cases a reality, that in the downturn of an economy, public employees have been more successful in protecting their level of pay and benefits than even union people in the private sector, and certainly than those who don't belong to a union. That may in many cases result in people being laid off in the public sector. And it certainly may result in a reduction in public services. But the perception is that those who have seniority or have secure positions to keep their jobs are relatively insulated from a lot of the sacrifices that other people are making. The same kind of resentment that I think Leslie was referring to that people have, understandably have, toward those at the top who seem to always come out on top and seem to do well, in a smaller scale exists among workers looking at people in the public sector compared to in the private sector. And as I say, that's not simply union versus non-union, because I can remember in the days when I was labor commissioner being very sensitive to some of the frustrations and the concerns between folks in the private sector unions with some of the benefits they saw people got in the public sector. That's a reality. Now, that doesn't mean that the people in Wisconsin are right or people in Ohio are right that are trying to change the whole system. But it does, I think, suggest that it's too easy to blame this on the folks in Wall Street and others and pretend that there's not an issue that has to be addressed. Because the biggest challenge I believe we face today, and there are plenty of them, but the biggest one is a lack of confidence people can seem to have in the ability of their government to work for them. And we need to find some way, working collaboratively, to restore confidence in our government if we want to get people to pay for the services they keep demanding and understand that there is a connection between the cost and the benefit, and that includes a sense that everybody who's working for the government is working in the same direction and working for them. Now, at one level, that's an impossible task, but at another level, if we look at it incrementally, of how do we each try to work to improve that sense that the government does serve as our service provider for many of our needs, I think that gives us a chance, and that's how we ought to be addressing this issue.
Okay, we're hearing a number of issues now. We're looking at class differences, we're looking at fairness, public versus private unions, union employees, non-union employees, politics, who's management in the public sector. Maybe we should take a little closer look at some positives, benefits of unions. Leslie, you want to start this?
So I hope before the day is done to be able to respond more directly to some of Jack's comments about the concept of shared sacrifice and how that has affected the public sector. But for now, I want to answer the immediate question, which has to do with the values of unions. And I think the best way to do that really is probably more by anecdote than by abstraction. I believe that unions serve as a voice for working families and the middle class in this country, and not just for the members who pay dues to the unions. I want to talk about a couple of examples specific to Oregon. One example is the twice passage of ballot measures increasing the minimum wage in this state, the second one indexing it to inflation, so that even during what I would call the dog days of the Bush administration, when the federal minimum wage was so low that you were forced into poverty, Oregon had a higher minimum wage, and our lowest wage workers had a greater ability to support themselves than in many other states. A second example is ending usury by payday lenders who often, until 2 years ago, charged interest rates in excess of 500% a year to people who, because they were short of cash, were required to take, and didn't have good credit, were required to take loans at payday lending stores. There's the work that's been done defeating countless Bill Sizemore ballot measures and his efforts to bring the Tea Party to Oregon before the Tea Party existed nationally. Their efforts to increase nursing home staffing levels in this state, and as a result of these efforts, staffing levels in Oregon's nursing homes went from being some of the lowest in the country to being some of the highest. Efforts to protect funding for employment-related daycare, which allows low-wage working parents to go to work because they get subsidized daycare and can afford to have their children taken care of. The work last year passing Measure 66 and 67, which was successful in preventing or mitigating some of the budget cuts that we would otherwise have seen. Now, I don't want to overclaim here. All of these accomplishments were the work of coalitions, and I want to credit and honor the allies and advocates, including I'm sure many people in this room who contributed to those struggles. But I would argue that in each of those cases, the role of the labor movement generally and public employee unions specifically was decisive and determinative. And so if we look back, I believe that none of those accomplishments that I mentioned would have happened had there not been a strong public sector labor movement in the state. Now, I picked those examples on purpose because they're not directly about collective bargaining, because I think it's important to recognize that the labor movement is about much more than collective bargaining, and that so much of what union members do with their families, with their communities, really advantages the entire working class and our communities. But it also has to do with wages and benefits. Here again, I'd say that the labor movement is able to raise the wages and benefits of all workers, not just those who are union members. I'll tell a story from a different state. I started working for the union in Connecticut, where I organized nursing home workers. There was a small town in Connecticut that had 2 nursing homes on opposite sides of the street. I never understood how that small a town could have 2 nursing homes, but it did. One of them was union, and the other was not. And every time we won a wage increase at the unionized home, the employer at the home across the street would grant a comparable wage increase to the employees there. And I think they did it for 2 reasons. One was they needed to compete to recruit and retain the most qualified workers, and also, less honorably, I think they wanted to make sure that their employees didn't join a union. But I remember being at a union meeting at that facility where one worker was complaining, how come we do all the work and the nurses' aides across the street get the same raises? And another member, a woman named Linda Verrill, said, actually, I think that's a good thing. I'm so proud that to be part of a union where we have enough strength to raise wages not just for us, but for our entire community. And finally, one more story, because I see that I'm out of time, and then I'll stop. And that's a story of a member here in Oregon. And this is I think we all have stories that we turn back to when we need inspiration. And that's the story of a woman named Karen Thompson, who was a home care worker, a public worker, who cared for frail and elderly seniors in her home. And she was instrumental in 1999 in gaining home care workers the right to bargain under the Public Employee Collective Bargaining Act. Karen organized the union because she cared about training for home care workers and because she cared about the quality of care and the number of hours that her clients got. She was also on the bargaining team that bargained the first contract for home care workers and won health insurance for home care workers in this state. And shortly after winning that contract, Karen got cancer. And I had an opportunity to visit her in the hospital shortly before she died. And what she said to me is, I am so proud of the work that I did to build this union so that I have good health care, so that I have dignity, and so that I can leave knowing that I wasn't a burden to my family. And that story to me tells me as much as anything about the value of unions and why and how unions advocate for the entire middle class in this country.
In the limited time we've got, maybe we should look at the other side, trying to be fair and balanced on this. And maybe Jack can bring out some ideas about any concerns or problems you might face with unions, public sector unions.
Well, one of the first things, before I get to that, because I think Leslie's comments are interesting, but as I was listening to it, it helped to explain one of the reasons I think why we've seen such a decline in unions in the private sector. And it frankly has been because of the success that the unions have had, lobbying for a lot of the laws we have, going back to wage and hour laws, minimum wage laws, and other things that have given people as a matter of right certain protections that before they might have had to join a union to belong to. And as you mentioned with the case with people across the street, they got the same pay, the same benefits in order to compete. They didn't have to pay union dues. And I think one of the problems that unions are having in the private sector is trying to explain to them, what are we going to get for paying dues out of our paycheck? And that's one of the challenges I think that the union movement faces overall is to move to the next level of what is it that you're really going to offer. Now, if you talk about the public employee unions, I think that the main thing that they provide is the same thing they provide in the private sector, which is a voice and representation for the workforce. It used to be years ago, and you've probably seen quotes, they say that FDR said there was no place for unions in the public sector, and George Meany said there wasn't. And that was based in large part on an old model of unions, which was we have to get together to fight, pardon the expression, those bastards that own the business and wrench away from those greedy guys the money that they're keeping from us. And since by definition people in the public sector don't get the money, there's not for profit, they don't need to have protection against them. I think that vision was both exaggerating the extent to which that kind of overt greed rather than economic self-interest, which everyone has, dominates in the private sector. It also probably gave a little bit too much credit to the altruism of people in the public sector. And so the idea of what does a union give you? It gives you a united voice so they can't pit one worker against another to drive down wages and benefits and their working conditions. But it also gives you a way to have a unified voice in a lot of other things in the workplace that go beyond just wages and benefits. And most polls over the years have shown that the main thing people look for in a union is that I get to have some voice about how things are run. I don't have to take it or leave it. And my alternative isn't to do things the way I'm told or go get another job, but I have a chance for some input. And those areas where people say, well, why don't you join a union? It's because they're relatively satisfied with the place of employment. And so worker satisfaction, which often goes way beyond the question of just wages and benefits, is really what determines that. Now, today, what's the issue about public employee unions? The main issue that is characterized, and I'm again going to be trying to channel what I believe the folks in Wisconsin and other places are the point they're trying to make, and it's not necessarily my view, but the idea is, as I mentioned before, in the public sector, there is an opportunity for the people on one side of the table, labor, to influence and affect who sits on the other side. If in the private sector, a union tried to influence a board of directors election, that would be an unfair labor practice, unlawful practice, and there could be trouble. Just as if the employer, the company, tried to influence a union election and tried to get someone favorable to the company elected. That's against the law. But in the public sector, it's a constitutional right, because the public employees are also citizens, they're voters, they're taxpayers, and they obviously have the same right to participate in that. But the theory is that creates an inequity, and that therefore you don't have people bargaining on the other side who are as directly connected to the economic self-interest of management as they are in the private sector. And that's why in a lot of states they don't allow it. The federal government, while it allows unions, doesn't do collective bargaining. When President Obama announced a 3-year freeze on federal employee wages, he didn't have to bargain it. He didn't have to go back to the table. They could do that. And yet we don't go to the unemployment office and see people leaving their federal jobs to go on unemployment because it's a better deal. We don't see them standing in line for food stamps. So it's not that this is a question of indigency versus representation. There are different ways to do that. My own view is once you have collective bargaining, it's not realistic to try to go back. That's why I think that what they're doing in Wisconsin, Ohio ultimately will fail. That doesn't mean that the other states that don't have it are going to follow suit. And the question is, how do we together try to figure out ways that we can have the kind of inclusive involvement and cooperation in the public sector that we need to have to be successful?
You have touched on some of this now. I think we need to get into more than the past, more than the present, the future. What is going to happen? What is likely to happen in the public sector unions in the United States, in our great state of Oregon? Okay, what's the future hold? Let's go with you, Leslie.
So I want to talk about the future, but I want to take just 1 minute here to sort of address some of the questions about public employee compensation, because I think that Jack talked a lot about perceptions, and I think there is the perception out there that public employees are better compensated than private sector employees. And in fact, when you look at just wages, in fact, public workers make less. When you look at wages and benefits together, it comes out to about equal, but the Economic Policy Institute did a study recently that says that on average nationally, public employees, including both wages and benefits together, make 3.7% less when you compare like job categories. And specifically in Oregon, the state sponsors a study called the Joint Committee on Salary Surveys, which found that when you looked at all of the jobs in aggregate, that the state workers specifically earned 96.6% of what their counterparts in the private made, and that is, again, wages and benefits combined. In general, even less on wages, a little bit more in benefits, but if you look at total compensation, I want to throw the statistic out there because I do agree with Jack that that perception is there, but I also think that we need to challenge perceptions with facts, and the facts are that when you compare apples to apples, public employees make, in fact, less when they do comparable work. On the question of the future, I think that there are a couple things that I hope we'll see in the future. One is I think we need to see more private sector organizing led by public sector unions, and that's because of the issue that actually both Jacks raised about the declining density in the private sector, which makes unionization look like an exception rather than the rule, a privilege to be envied as opposed to a right that everybody should share. I would challenge Jack on one thing, and that is about the reason why more private sector workers don't join unions, and I would argue that that is because with the state of the law today, private sector employers are basically given carte blanche to do a lot of harassment and intimidation and fear when private sector workers do choose to try to organize, and I think that's the greatest disincentive. I think that you're going to see unions more involved in the future in crafting concrete budget solutions because I think we're really clear that we need to not only say what's wrong with the cuts that are proposed, but propose solutions of our own. And I think Local 503 in Oregon is pioneering in some of that work, looking more closely at how do we collect revenue in this state and could we do it better, led by the union members of the Department of Revenue who do that work. I think you're going to see more partnership between unions and management specifically to improve the quality of services. And one example that I would point to there is some great work that was done last year by management at the Department of Human Services here in Oregon, along with union members, saying how can we work together to improve the process where people applying for food stamps are granted eligibility. And by working together, they were able to reduce the wait time on new food stamp applications from 30 days to same-day service. And I think that's the model of the kind of thing that I hope the future will bring more of. I also think the future will bring more, at least in the short term, of shared sacrifice, because the reality is the budgets are what they are, and state workers in this state have already led on shared sacrifice, working on unpaid furlough days. In the 8 years that I was executive director of 503, 4 of them we got no cost of living increase for state workers, and I think that there is more shared sacrifice ahead. I also hope that the unions that unionized workers will lead the effort to make sure that that sacrifice is truly shared. And one of the things that I think we need to do that is to really focus more on the questions of who really did cause the economic crisis and to hold accountable those corporations who I believe are responsible for the economic mess that we're in. And I want to just end with really the reason that I'm here today, because to be honest, who should be sitting in this chair is Heather Conroy, who is my successor as the executive director of Local 503. And I'm kind of pitch hitting today for Heather because she is 12 blocks down the road at a protest at U.S. Bank, one of 14 such protests happening at U.S. banks across the state as we speak. And the reason for that protest is because U.S. Bank holds the contract for the debit cards that people who get unemployment insurance this state get. And in addition to earning a significant amount of interest off of that contract because they hold the money for the benefits, they also charge exorbitant fees to the unemployed people that they're supposed to serve. So although you get your benefits deposited weekly, if you withdraw more than twice a month, you pay a fee. If you use an ATM that isn't owned by U.S. Bank, you pay a fee. And if you need to talk to a teller, you pay a fee. That contract is up for renewal this year, and I hope that the future for public employees will be public employee unionism in the state will partly be about leading the state to find ways like renegotiating the U.S. Bank contract so that we can solve the budget deficit without the devastating cuts to the services that all Oregonians rely on.
Jack, what do you see as the future for and implications for people here and people throughout the great state of Oregon?
Well, I think the real question that we face at a lot of levels is how do we bring into balance the government we want and the government we're willing to pay for. And a lot of what we're talking about here is really dealing with that. And I do agree that a lot of the concerns that people have today are misperceptions. A lot of it are easy ways that people can continue to convince themselves that if only people would work for less, if only they could change the rules of the game, they can still get everything that they want and not pay any more. By the same token, I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that there need to be different ways of doing business. And I think that there have been some positive steps that have been made, and so the comments I'm about to make are not necessarily to be applied to everybody. But I think we still have within the public employee union system a tendency for thinking about jobs in an old-fashioned way. That there are clear job descriptions, you don't go beyond those job descriptions, you shouldn't be asked to do certain things that aren't within that because you're then taking a job away from someone else. That there's a tendency to believe that there's a clear hierarchy of management and labor and that you don't cross the line. And that's not what's happening in the private sector today. Self-directed work teams, working in a more collaborative way, all those things are good and important and will help us find ways to deliver services more cost-effective way. And I think if we do that, we'll go a lot farther towards trying to move ahead of this than simply refighting the old battles of the past or trying to figure out who to blame for the last disaster while we blithely move toward the next one.
Okay, in the time we've got left, what is the most important thing that you want the audience here to know about public sector unions? Leslie?
So I think I'd close by asking the question of what's at stake. And to answer that question, I need to get a little historical. Starting in the 1930s, when unions really began growing, we created a country where there were still rich and poor, but where a majority of people had a middle-class life, a decent place to live, a good education for our children, and public services that created cohesive and strong communities. Immigrants came to this country not to become Howard Hughes or Donald Trump, but because they knew that if they worked hard, they could build a decent life for themselves and their children, and in large numbers they did. Unions, which raised standards for all working people, were a key part of that, and a vibrant public sector created communities that people wanted to live in. What's at stake in Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, and all across this country are the very values that we hold dear in America: family, community, service, shared sacrifice, and a belief that if you work hard, you'll be able to raise a family and live a decent life. Let me be clear. Collective bargaining is not an end in itself. It is a means to maintaining core American values of honesty and fair play and creating a balance so that everybody in our society gets a fair shake. Because of unions, there was a time when most jobs in America came with the promise of health insurance, pension, raises when times were good, vacation and sick time, and a shared sense of loyalty and commitment between workers and their employers. Unions brought these things to working people, both those who were members and those who were not. When unions were strong, it was possible to imagine a society where most people lived good, decent lives and could provide a better life for their children. It's tragic that just 30 or 40 years later, that goal, that dream is slipping away in America. Today, the people who deliver the essential public services we rely on, but all too often take for granted, the people who still have some measure of what we've always held dear in America, decent wages, health care, a secure retirement, are being portrayed as villains because so many other working people have lost so much in recent decades, including, most of all, hope. If there's a silver lining in the assault on the middle class that's playing out in so many state capitals across the country, and I think there is, it is the opportunity to recapture that spirit of hope. The response to the policies promoted by governors like Scott Walker, policies that fail to create jobs, that gut needed services like education and health care, that give away tax dollars to the very group that was least hurt by the recession, says, I think, a lot about the resilience of core American values about fair play. And if we can, as a nation, stay true to those values, it is at least possible that this year's unrest could be a turning point towards something better.
Jack, your view.
I sometimes wish it were possible to go back to the future, that we could pick an idealized time in the past and we could return to. Most of those times were not quite as great as we tend to remember them now. The 1930s certainly would not be the time I would go back to. The 1950s might have been pretty nice if you were white, middle class, and male. I think the 1990s looked pretty good compared to what we've been through today. But the reality is, for better or worse, we're condemned to live the rest of our life in the future. The structure of the economy has changed. The workforce is changing. we need to be addressing that in a way that looks positively toward how we do that, and not think that we can simply roll back the clock and have it a different way. I do think there are a lot of people, and actually I think Leslie is one of those who is very interested in doing that, and figuring out how we can work together in a way that does have a return to more of the family wage jobs. It does give us the opportunity in this country to make things and sell things in a broader economy, and makes it possible for us to have the government services we want and need, and the people who are providing them are paid fairly with some reasonable job security, but also some performance standards and some idea of what we're getting so that the public is reassured they're getting their money's worth. All those things can happen if we work together. It's not going to happen by either romanticizing the past or demonizing each other. It's going to happen when we understand our mutual self-interest come from working together.
Thank you, Jack Roberts. Thank you, Leslie Frane.
The first question of our speaker will be from our Friday Forum host. Our host today is City Club Governor Pat McCormick. For 20 years, Pat was a partner at Conklin, Fiskin & McCormick, a public affairs, research, and public relations firm. Now, Pat is a partner at AMPMPR, a Portland public relations firm he recently started with his daughter, Allison. Pat has been a City Club member since 1969. Pat?
Thank you, Charity, and thank you to our panelists for today. As Charity noted, I'm an older person. I've been in the club since 1969. My first session working in Salem at the legislature was 1973 when we passed Oregon's public employee collective bargaining law. Listening to your comments today and thinking about where we were back then and how far we have come, I also think about the nearer term of our political debate, which has been polarized by the kind of class warfare comments that I think we've heard on both sides. To me, one of the things that Oregonians decided in this last election was that they wanted to get away from that, and they elected a legislature that's now evenly divided between the parties, and where the rhetoric has changed substantially in the dialogue and debate in Salem. As you look at what's happening down there, what is your own view of what responsibility the sides in the debate have to temper their conversation so that we can get productive work done?
Well, first of all, if anything that I said suggested I support class warfare, I would retract those words and apologize. I think that that's exactly what we do need to get away from, and I'm encouraged by what we're seeing in Salem. I think that it is one of those silver linings of a difficult time is that people are focused on trying to get things done. I do think that Governor Kitzhaber has been working effectively with both parties, and both parties are responding to each other as well as to that. If someone had told me a few years ago that we would have co-speakers of the House and they'd be getting along and moving things forward, I would have wondered what state they were talking about. But as it is, I do think there's responsibility on everyone's part to try to focus their rhetoric on the issues, not on personalities, and not on demonizing one side or the other. We are all in this together. We have to find our way to get out of it together.
We will now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership, so again, another reason to join today. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your questions in 30 seconds or less. If I flash the infamous question mark card, it means we're waiting for your question. Thank you.
I am Bill Harris. I'm a City Club member. I really appreciate your last comment, Mr. Roberts, the need to recognize that we are all in this together. I think that needs to come to the front of the table. My question relates to perceptions and the perception that we in this room have toward state employee unions. We don't have a strong union membership recognized amongst our audience today, but we do have distinct perceptions of this issue and great interest in it. I think one factor in the development of our general perception is the great problem which developed in the state employees' retirement program. Could one of you review the facts that might answer the question, who did what, when, to make this occur?
So I don't think I can do this question justice in about the 60 seconds that it's probably appropriate for me to take, but let me just share a few facts. The average pension of a PERS retiree who retired, and this is the average from the last 20 years, is $25,400 a year. So this is not the stuff that a life of luxury is made out of. That the statistic that I gave earlier about total compensation that showed that public employees on average in this state earn less than their counterparts in the private sector, that included retirement as part of that package. The PERS right now is 88% funded, and if you look at what the actuaries tell you is for a pension plan to be financially healthy, it needs to be 80% funded. So at this point, we have a well-funded pension plan, although that was not always true. And in fact, the pension payments are going to go down over time because the tier 1 pensioners, the people who had the richest of the pension plans, are over time going to work their way out of the system. So that bubble will work its way through. I think there are situations where we need to look at reforming pensions, and certainly in many states throughout the country, unions have sat at the table and done that. And I also think when it comes to pensions, one of the things that I'd like to look more at is, can we use our pension funds, which have significant assets, to invest in infrastructure projects in order to create the jobs that we need to help our economy recover? Because I think pensions actually can play a very positive role in helping the economy recover and building good jobs now and in the future.
I'll just add one little thing to that, because what you're really, and you can't be repeating too many times, there were some terrible mistakes made in planning for the future of the pension plans, not out of ill will, but because of people assumed that certain projections would go on forever, and so the 8% guarantee, the money match, the way it was originally funded, those were terrible mistakes. The problem is that the Supreme Court, interpreting the United States Constitution, said we couldn't really change that for existing employees. Now, no one wanted to change the existing contracts. The question was, could you prospectively change the way the system worked? And they said no. That's why we have the Tier 1 issue. It is, in effect, what they call a legacy cost that we seem to have our hands tied for dealing with. We have dealt actually very effectively as a state, both with the change in the 95 session and later the 2003 session, which was very contentious, and it cost 2 Oregon politicians, both Democrats, their careers in politics, perhaps. I mean, they're not dead yet, so they may be back. But they made a huge sacrifice. But as a result of that, we are back on a glide path. And we, frankly, coming out of the stock market crash in 2001, we did a real great job of recovering it, and then crashed again. And so that's put us off track. But I think that the frustration people have is very understandable. But it's very limited in what we can do. And the pensions that people who are now going to work for state and local governments have is very different. It's much more comparable to what's in the private sector. And so a lot of the frustration that's being taken out on people, it's the wrong people and the wrong issue. And I understand it, but it's something that we have to continue to watch and deal with. But a lot has already been done.
And I'm a City Club member. I want to ask about the election of 2008. In the Democratic primary for Attorney General, there were 2 candidates. One was a political neophyte, and one was a legislator who'd been active in PERS reform. State employees gave the neophyte $700,000 in a race that I see no reason other than to punish his opponent, that the state employees had an interest. My question is that a fair description? And secondly, isn't that exactly what you're talking about, Jack, of having elected officials on one side dealing with people who have the ability to either support or punish them?
Well, I have a personal bias in that particular race, because even though I'm a Republican, I did support one of the candidates and he lost. But I think that's a reasonably accurate. I mean, I'm sure that there are people who would say there are other things involved, as there always are, but I think what you described is right. It's not the situation that the Attorney General sits at the other end of the bargaining table. That's handled in the governor's office and does that. But yes, that's an example of the political power that the unions have, and other elected officials look at that and say, I'm not going to make that mistake. The other person I mentioned was a state senator who worked for SEIU, as a matter of fact, and who led the fight to get that bill through, lost his job, and had to leave the legislature. And that does sort of raise the stakes for a lot of these folks to see what's happening. But Again, this is also, it's a free country. People have a right to give their campaign contributions to whoever they want to. And so that's a part of, inevitable part of the system when you have public employee unions.
So let me say two things about that. First, I don't think those numbers are quite right. But whenever the question comes up and I'm asked, did public employee unions retaliate against candidates who supported the PERS changes in 2003, I always think about what does that concept of retaliation mean? I'm guessing, and I might be wrong about this, but I'm guessing that the majority of people in this room did not phone back for or make contributions to Chris Dudley in the last gubernatorial election. And yet I don't think anybody would say that the City Club retaliated against Chris Dudley. You only think about retaliation if there's a sense of entitlement, that someone is somehow entitled to have the support of working people, or entitled to have working people not support an opponent. And I think that there shouldn't be a sense of entitlement about endorsements, because our members, when they contribute to politics, they do it 2 cents at a time, 2 cents per hour. They contribute voluntarily into our political action fund. And that's the money that we use. And I don't think that that's an entitlement. And I don't think it's a retaliatory question. I think it's a question of who do our members feel best represents the issues that they care about. And it's a broad list of issues, not 1 or 2 or 3, and a very democratic endorsement process where members sit down and interview candidates and say who represents them best. But I also think, if I can just finish, on a broader question about political power, I worry a lot about when people say, oh, public employee unions have too much political power. If you look in the last presidential election at the 10 political action committees nationally that gave the most to political candidates, 7 of those 10 were corporate PACs that contributed largely to conservative politicians. And the other 3 were public employee unions. And so whenever somebody says, oh, public employee unions have too much political influence, I think, well, what if those 3 weren't on the list? We would be left with a world where the top 10 political givers were all directly representing corporate interests. And I would argue that for people who care about things from civil rights to environmental issues to social justice, that would not be a good change.
I think that your last point is certainly fair. The question, though, I think that really what Barnes was asking is not that they retaliated by not contributing to the person who they felt had harmed them, but that the public sector donations, public sector employee donations to his opponent seem to be so disproportionate to what they have put into attorney general races in the past that the clear message that I think was received, whether it was intentional or not, and I think it was intentional, but whatever the case, other politicians looking at that said, I better be real careful not to cross these guys.
Elaine Cogan, a City Club member, and this is a question for both of you. We're hearing that civil rights, or the issue of civil rights, is going to be a rallying cry from the unions and others, building upon the fact that Martin Luther King was, his last act before he was assassinated, was in favor of the garbage workers unionizing in Memphis. And I'd like your opinion about that and any inside information you can give us.
Sure. April 4th is the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, and throughout the country, activities are planned for that day, both to honor Dr. King, but also to make the connection between the struggle that he was engaged with and what's going on today in Wisconsin and other states. You can't have civil rights unless you have economic justice, a point that Dr. King made over and over and over again, and a point that is very relevant today. I think I was very proud when the NAACP issued a statement condemning Scott Walker's actions in Wisconsin. And one of the things that the NAACP pointed out is that African Americans are disproportionately represented among the ranks of public employees, and I think that's for a good reason. It's because historically our government has had plenty of racism, but not as much racism as in the private sector. So it has been, government employment has been a particular path to the middle class for African Americans, and I was really glad to see the NAACP acknowledge that point, and I'm looking forward to the actions on April 4th.
Chris Andre, City Club member and KBOO programmer. I wasn't going to ask a question today, but you mentioned US Bank, and that triggered it. We're watching right now, it appears, a concerted effort characterized by the notorious Koch brothers of the forces on the right to use fear tactics once again to manipulate the American public. Banks are sitting on vast cash reserves, which, if infused into the economy, would alleviate these budgetary fears. What role, if any, or what could unions do to work with, negotiate with, persuade banks to release some of this cash into the economy so that we would get jobs rolling again and strengthen unions, both public and private, and reinvigorate our economy?
That's a great question, and I'll just answer with an example. Last week in Connecticut, our union sponsored demonstrations at about 12 different Bank of America branches, and the reason for that is because Bank of America, after getting a huge bailout on the taxpayer nickel, not only pays no income tax in Connecticut because banks are exempt from the corporate tax in Connecticut, but it has also decreased its lending to small businesses by something in the vicinity of 85% from the pre-recession levels. So I think what we can do is draw attention to the role that the banks and Wall Street have played in crashing our economy, and also work with elected officials to pass legislation that changes how banks are regulated to require that banks, particularly banks that took bailout money, actually pay attention to the needs of their community, whether it is in job creation, small business lending, or home loan modification.
We have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Join us next week for a talk about the future of aging through technological innovation. As we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation for today's guests, Leslie Frane, Jack Kondrasuk, and Jack Roberts. We are adjourned.